Resuming debate?
Resuming debate.
Resuming debate.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Resuming Debate. So for a certain kind of environmentalists, the big oil sands producers are the villain of the story that they want to tell. And yet, increasingly, major energy producers, oil sands producers, are actively involved in the conversation around climate change and are emphasizing their desire to advance the objective of net zero and to be part of the conversation about how to get there. So is this just, as some people say, kind of greenwashing, trying to cover up what they're doing in terms of energy production, or is there a sincere effort on the part of energy producers to advance towards the objectives of combating climate change? What are the pros, what are the cons of their involvement in this conversation? I'm very pleased to be joined by my friend and former boss, actually, from the Prime Minister's office a few years ago under Stephen Harper, Mark Cameron. Mark Cameron has been very involved in climate policy debates with different hats, but currently, he's working for an organization called Pathways Alliance that represents 6 major oil sands producers. Mark, it's great to have you on and to delve into this important topic.
Great to be on and great to talk to you again, Garnet.
Mark, you and I met when you were working at the Prime Minister's office, and thank you for helping me get in the door there. And it was at the time, I recall, certainly Conservatives were in government pursuing a climate policy agenda, and we're also very critical of the carbon tax. You would have been still in PMO. We launched a series of ads with a talking grease spot criticizing the tax on everything that was proposed by then Liberal leader Stéphane Dion. Tell us a bit about your personal journey on climate issues, from someone who worked in the Harper PMO to someone who was speaking in favor of carbon tax or carbon price, and now the work you do with Pathways Alliance.
Sure. Well, my interest and involvement in this issue actually goes back a few years before I worked for Prime Minister Harper. I did some work as a consultant with Environment Canada, with the Canadian Electricity Association, and got very interested in the whole question of climate and how Canada could reconcile its energy and natural resource abundance with trying to meet international expectations in terms of climate. So this has been an issue that I've been concerned with for a long time. During the Harper government, I think the Harper government went through a couple of distinct phases. The first year or so of the Harper government, there was an attempt to sort of change the channel away from climate and to talk about other issues to do with air pollution or chemical pollution and try to put climate into a separate category. By about the second or third year of the Harper government, it became apparent that strategy was not working. And that's when the government really did embrace, I think, quite a vigorous climate agenda under Minister Baird and Minister Prentice. There was the Turning the Corner plan that was quite an ambitious climate policy. Then in the 2008 election, one of the major themes was running against the carbon tax proposal that the Stéphane Dion had brought forward. But I think it's important to note that even at that time, the Harper government was proposing a different form of carbon pricing, but were attacking the idea of a consumer carbon tax. And I think ever since then, conservative political parties have used the issue of the consumer carbon tax as a political winner for them. But there's a really tricky balancing act between a tax on fuel at the pump or on home heating versus taking seriously the challenge to decarbonize our industrial sector, which is something that all of our international allies and financial institutions and so on are concerned with. And so I've been really interested in that balancing act and how we get that right as a country, which is part of why I worked with Canadians for Clean Prosperity and did advance the idea of carbon pricing from a conservative perspective. And that's also part of the reason that I ended up working with the Pathways Alliance with an industry that really is taking this seriously.
So one thing you said there was fascinating. Well, sorry, everything you said there was fascinating. But one thing I want to drill down on further, the distinction you made between a consumer carbon tax that was advocated by Stéphane Dion, kind of rhetorically de-emphasized by the Liberals in the intervening years, but ultimately implemented by the Trudeau government. That as distinct from what you called a carbon pricing mechanism that was used by the Harper government. Tell me a bit more about that distinction, and to the extent that you think it's possible to have a carbon pricing mechanism without a consumer carbon tax.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to take a position for or against a consumer carbon tax. I mean, obviously, the Liberals have been actively promoting it for the past few years. Conservatives have been opposing it. But where there's a broader consensus is on the idea of industrial carbon pricing as a mechanism to incent action on reducing emissions by heavy industry. And so the province of Alberta in 2007 brought in the ESCR regulation, the special gases emissions regulation. That was one of the first carbon prices in North America and the world. And really the current Alberta carbon pricing model, which has been adopted by the federal government and many other provinces, is what's called an output-based pricing system, where heavy industry pays a carbon price on a percentage of their emissions based on a target, and that incents them to try to reduce their emissions below that target level. And that's been a really pretty successful mechanism. It does take into account that, because there's with these output-based allocations, it takes into account trade competitiveness and so on. And it's kind of the basis of the industrial carbon pricing system in most provinces, in Alberta, in Ontario, and at the federal level. So I do think that, there's a lot of value in that mechanism and making it work, even if there's still going to be a continued debate over whether or not, consumers should pay a carbon tax on home heating or on fuel at the pump.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's an important distinction then for people to appreciate, because in our political debates around climate policy, certainly the left makes the sort of presumption that price on carbon equals consumer carbon tax, and to start with recognizing that there are distinct models that involve some kind of a pricing mechanism without the same kind of consumer tax that the government has advocated. So thank you for making that distinction. So you've kind of talked about some of this other work you've done moving forward to your current work at Pathways Alliance. Did you start working with them just as this alliance was formed? How long has this alliance been in existence? Tell us a bit about the alliance and what its purpose is.
The Oil Sands Pathways to Net Zero Alliance, which was the old name of the organization, which was too much of a mouthful, so it's now just the Pathways Alliance. It started really in June of 2021, when 5 and now 6 of the major oil sands companies came together and said that they were going to embrace a target of net zero on production emissions by 2050, with an initial plan to do carbon capture and storage and use other technologies to reduce emissions by 22 megatons per year by 2030. So that commitment was made in June of 2021. At that point, it was really a joint project of the companies, but I joined in February of 2022. And then in June of 2022, the Pathways Alliance has now become a formal organization. So in addition to that common project of building a carbon capture and storage network and trying to reduce emissions by 22 megatons, we're doing more of the industry association type function. So dealing with other issues like land and water and some of the other issues related to the oil sands as well.
Mm-hmm. So this alliance, independent of any other forms of cooperation, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, et cetera, this is an alliance that's specifically focused on a common approach around climate policy, operations, and advocacy. Is that right?
Exactly. Like a condition of being a member of the Pathways Alliance is accepting a net zero 2050 target and supporting this common project with common infrastructure. We represent the 6 largest oil sands companies: Canadian Natural, Cenovus, ConocoPhillips Canada, Imperial, MEG, and Suncor, and collectively that's 95% of the oil sands production in Alberta and Canada. It's a major chunk of the industry. There are other smaller oil sands players, and we've been very open and transparent with them, and are welcoming them to cooperate on our joint infrastructure and so on. Yeah, this really represents the larger oil sands companies.
Yeah. Okay, so to the skeptics who say, wait a second, companies exist to maximize value for their shareholders, what is really motivating these companies to talk in this kind of way? Is this just a marketing exercise? Tell us a bit about kind of the motivations for the companies to get together and do this kind of work.
I think it is still motivated by maximizing value for shareholders, but the question is, do you look at that on a quarter by quarter basis, or do you look at that on a long-term basis? Because increasingly, it's becoming more difficult to raise capital, to insure projects, if you aren't committed to climate goals. And there are many large European insurance companies that have said they won't insure the oil sands. I just saw Credit Suisse came out with a policy today saying that They won't invest in any company that has more than 10% of its revenue from oil sands. So we're facing this kind of pressure internationally, and we want to demonstrate that we are actually serious about climate, that we recognize that climate change is a genuine problem, and that we have a serious committed path to reducing our emissions. So this is being done for business reasons. This is really about the long-term viability of the industry.
Okay, so you see this still from a fundamentally like a shareholder capitalism framework that in order to make money and generate value, companies have to commit to these kinds of roles. I guess again, channeling what some of the critics or the cynics might say, does that mean it's real, or does that mean you just have to set these targets, and 2050 is a long ways off, so you can set those kind of long-term targets and just say you're setting them?
Yeah.
What verifies the fact that this is real?
Well, I mean, obviously, we're accountable. We report, all of our emissions to both provincial and federal government, and so we're going to be held accountable for claims in our plans. But it's not just to get back to the question of sort of stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. I don't necessarily think that there's a contradiction. I think Warren Buffett talks about being long-term greedy, right? That in the long term, a sustainable industry requires more than just short-term profit maximization. It requires, infrastructure, good schools, sound legal framework. So companies have an interest in those things as well as just what their next quarterly return is going to be.
Yeah, and let's dig more into that a little bit later, because I'm really interested in that philosophical debate around shareholder capitalism and its limits, and we've had some folks on the podcast before to talk about it. But just before we get there, I mean, a few more points on the immediate work of the alliance. I'm curious how this is being received, right? So you kind of alluded to the fact that there are some challenges with funders, insurers, and others, and some of the criticisms of the oil sands leading to challenges in attracting capital. Do you think, I guess it's still fairly nascent, but do you think your work, the work of the Alliance, is shifting perceptions, or is it a tough nut to crack there?
It is a tough nut to crack, but I do think that we are having some success in shifting opinions. I think there are a number of financial institutions, particularly the Canadian banks and the large Canadian pension funds and so on, that recognize the work that we're doing and are increasingly willing to talk to their international peers to say, the oil sands are not what you think they are, and these companies are really committed to climate goals, really have excellent ESG track records. So I think we are actually moving the dial in terms of perception with some of these financial institutions, and increasingly internationally as well. I mean, we have our companies do investor days in New York and London and Europe, and I think the message is getting out that the oil sands is serious about climate and has a plan to get to net zero, and that is changing perceptions. But there's still a lot of voices out there that would say that all fossil fuels should be excluded from investment, or oil sands should be singled out as a kind of fossil fuel that should not be acceptable. So we are actively working and pushing back against those voices, and some of them have some traction in financial institutions, particularly in Europe. So.
Mm-hmm. In terms of these financial institutions, are they kind of wired to really check the details in terms of the effectiveness of the plans you have in place, or are they primarily responding to public opinion? In other words, if the oil sands are doing well on many of these issues, but they're still losing the public opinion war, will these international financial institutions respond to the public opinion dynamics, or will they respond to the facts on the ground?
Well, I think there's a range, and certainly when I was working with the government of Alberta, we spent a fair amount of time dealing with some of these financial institutions, and a lot of them were responding to shareholder motions coming from activist groups and things like that, and hadn't necessarily looked into the details. And when we explained to them the details of what the records were of these companies, or even just the fact that the oil sands was the largest portion of the Canadian oil and gas industry, a lot of international financial institutions had no idea that Suncor and CNRL and these large companies, that this was the mainstay of their business. They sort of thought of oil sands as a a fairly exotic form of petroleum extraction, like shale oil or Arctic drilling or something like that. That was a relatively small portion of the industry, whereas in fact it is the largest portion of the Canadian oil and gas industry and represents 96% of our petroleum reserves. So I think just that education has been important, and some of those companies have changed their tune over the past couple of years.
Yeah. Those are some pretty foundational points to to not know about. So that's interesting. Are you engaged in trying to shift public opinion on these things as well? I'm curious to drill more into your experience at COP 27 and the people you have interacted with there. But is that part of the mandate of Pathways, is to try to persuade the man on the street, the woman on the street in Berlin or New York or wherever to think differently about Alberta oil?
Yeah, well, I don't think we've started to try to impact the man on the street in New York or Berlin, but we've certainly started trying to educate and inform public opinion here in Canada. You may have seen our ads recently, the Clear the Air campaign, where we're essentially saying, yes, we acknowledge that oil sands is part of the problem. We represent 10% of Canada's emissions, but we have a concrete plan to reduce emissions by 22 million tons by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And inviting the public to find out more about pathwaysalliance.ca. We're actually seeing that these ads have been quite effective, and that we are getting a lot of response, a lot of visits to our website, a lot of requests for information. And we think we are nudging public opinion towards understanding the role of the oil sands and our commitment on climate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So maybe jumping in a bit of a different direction then. So I had Elizabeth May on the podcast a while back, and I was talking to her about, her philosophy around environment and climate and so forth. And for her, and I think for many other people that are kind of close to her politically, there are moral absolutes at play here, right? Like thou shalt not be emitting, or else the consequences will be devastating. And I don't know that she would say as an absolute you should never emit or never be involved in emissions. But I think for her and for those who are sort of close to her politically, if you are involved in 10% of the country's emissions, you're just one of the bad guys, and you should stop doing that bad thing of emitting. And your approach is clearly different. It's to say there's a need for emissions, but we should be trying to work together to improve our performance over time. You probably have a lot of these kinds of conversations with people like Elizabeth. So how do you make that distinction between, I guess the way I see it is it's a distinction between a kind of pragmatic, instrumental approach to meeting a number of policy objectives at the same time versus a kind of moral absolute, you ought not to be producing these emissions, period.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with that. And I think, really when you look at it, the issue is not fossil fuels. The issue is emissions. So the fossil fuels, whether it's oil, gas, or even coal, are the most energy dense, efficient forms of production of energy that we've discovered in the natural world until the discovery of nuclear fission. But certainly on a mass scale, oil, gas, and coal are the mainstays of energy production around the world. And they're really remarkable chemical properties of fossil fuels that allow them to basically power the industrial economy and provide heat and cook food and transport people from place to place. All the things that we have to do in a society are running on energy, which up until now has been mostly fossil fuels. The issue is not fossil fuels. The issue is emissions. And if we can reduce emissions but continue to use fossil fuels, then we should. And I think there are ways in the long run. You could have natural gas with carbon capture producing blue hydrogen. So you could have a completely non-emitting source of energy coming from fossil fuels. So the issue is not fossil fuels. The issue is emissions, and you can't, stop emitting. Even Elizabeth May, still has to breathe air and therefore is producing carbon dioxide. So no one can stop emitting. The question is, how do you reduce emissions, in a responsible way? And you are trying to do multiple things. Like there's definitely a problem with emissions and climate, but there are issues of energy security and energy poverty, and we have to look at these things holistically.
Right. So, and I guess part of that is looking at, you were talking about people needing energy, being able to do vital things that are important to their lives. There's sort of a basket of goods out there, and policy is about looking at how to maximize all of those goods, not to kind of idolize one particular good at the expense of others, right? Like if we only cared about reducing emissions, then then could freeze to death, right? But that's not the only thing we care about. We care about it as well as security, as well as prosperity, and we try to figure out a way to have as many of these things at once.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And policy is always about trade-offs between different goods and different costs.
I guess another point to the other side on this would be that, are we going fast enough? Because again, those that are part of the kind of extreme or very active environmental movement would really emphasize sort of the crisis proportions of where we're at, and even suggest that, well, if we don't take certain steps now, the planet is going to be uninhabitable at a certain point. And I'm skeptical of these kinds of arguments. But what do you say to those who have a really dire interpretation of the data and say, well, it's not good enough to be balancing off this basket of goods right now because we have to, at a minimum, survive?
I understand that point of view, but you look at what's happened in Europe in the past year with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you can see that these trade-offs are not simple. That there are imperatives that are even greater than the imperative of climate, and we're seeing some of that play out this year. What I would say is that there is an emerging consensus on this idea of net zero by 2050. And it's pretty remarkable because this term only came into the lexicon around 2017, 2018, but it's been embraced by, about 160 governments, by most large industries, by most ENGOs, financial institutions. So essentially the whole spectrum of people have embraced this goal of net zero by 2050. And there's a lot of debate about how fast we get there, what is the net versus the gross, but there is a common goal and a common trajectory. And I think that increasingly that's the price of admission to the debate, is saying we have this common goal of net zero by 2050, and let's discuss how we get there. And I think, as long as everyone is pulling in that same direction, then you can have voices saying, let's go faster, let's go slower, let's go right, let's go left, but they're still agreeing on the ultimate destination.
Yeah, I mean, I think there'd be some who say that's not good enough and we need to move much further, much faster. But let's talk a bit about the net zero idea and what specific plan the oil sand sector is bringing to the table around getting there. So concretely, what would net zero look like? What does it look like, and how do we realize that objective?
Two things. One is, when we talk about net zero for the oil sands, we're talking about our production emissions. So in climate speak, that would be the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Where at the end of the day, we're still producing oil, which is, a lot of it is still being combusted as fuel or used for other products like petrochemicals and so on. So there's those further emissions downstream are the scope 3 emissions. We're talking about eliminating our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, those direct emissions and the electricity emissions associated with them that go into the production of the oil sand. We have basically a 3-phase plan to do so. Phase 1 involves building a carbon capture network that would be one of the largest carbon capture network, could actually be the largest carbon capture network in the world. We would build a 400-kilometer long pipeline going from Fort McMurray down to the Cold Lake region. We would gather CO2 from about 14 different different oil sands facilities along the route and sequester it underground south of Cold Lake in a carbon sequestration area that could ultimately store up to a gigaton of carbon. So that is the phase 1 plan. And then phases 2 and 3 involve continuing to build out that carbon capture network and adding more oil sands facilities onto the plant, but also looking at other forms of technology, such as replacing natural gas with hydrogen fuel, such as replacing natural gas with small modular reactors, such as direct air capture, where you pull carbon directly from the air and sequester it underground. So these are all the things that we'd be looking at to get from 22 megaton reduction by 2030 to ultimately an 83 megaton reduction by 2050. And then whatever leftover emissions we can't reduce, we would look at other kinds of offsets, so whether that's forestry, agriculture, or other things like that.
On the offset side, then, how does an offset work? Like you're paying maybe just explain what kinds of offsets could be bought and the impact of that.
Offsets aren't honestly a big part of our plan. Offsets are the kind of the last mile, as it were. If we end up reducing our emissions by 73 megatons and we have 10 megatons left that we can't reduce just because there's no substitutes, then we would be looking at offsets, and that can be things like paying for reforestation or paying for better agricultural practices or capturing methane from landfills and things like that, where we can offset our emissions by helping pay for emissions reductions that happen elsewhere. But as I say, that's actually not our primary focus. Our primary focus is how do we reduce our own emissions as efficiently as possible.
Okay. Yeah, but I think it is interesting to hear your thoughts on the offset piece in general, because there's a lot of other people talking about offsets as part of it, right? And I guess I wonder if we're really close to actually achieving this goal by 2050, do the range of available offsets decrease, right? There may only be so many external purchases of emissions
Sure.
reductions that can be achieved.
No, that's a challenge because the more of the economy that is covered by regulation or carbon pricing, then there aren't going to be as many offsets available because those industries will also be covered by regulation or carbon pricing. So you don't have another sector that can absorb those offsets. That's where the ultimate form of offset is probably direct air capture, which is very
Right.
expensive today. But ultimately, if we could have low cost direct air capture, then that would be the ultimate form of offset because you're basically taking carbon directly from the air and either storing it underground or turning into some other kind of product.
Yeah. So related to that, I mean, how much of this relies on speculation about technology development? Obviously, there will be improvements in technology in the next 25 years, but we don't necessarily know what those improvements will be and how quickly they'll unfold. And yet, looking at some of I know the government's plans around environmental performance, there does seem to be a lot riding on future technologies will allow us to do such and such, and the presumption that a particular technology will pan out as expected when it might not.
That's a great point, and I think we know that today the only technology that really works is carbon capture, which is why our first priority is getting the largest facilities that are the closest to the pipeline route and getting carbon capture going in those facilities. But as we go further down the road, we know there's going to be other technologies involved, and so it could be that small modular reactors end up being the low cost solution by the mid 2030s. But maybe it'll be improvements in hydrogen. Maybe we'll have more advanced forms of CCS that we don't have today that can capture more dilute forms of carbon. So we're putting bets on all those technologies. We know that we don't have all the technology we need today, but we have the technology we need to do that first leg and reduce by 22 megatons. But going forward, I don't know what the mix is going to be between those different technologies.
That's interesting. So you're talking in terms of specifics, I think realistic planning. My impression has been that there's a lot of willingness to throw around the net zero by 2050 line by governments, by individuals, maybe by certain companies, because it's easy to make a commitment that is 25 years out, right? Do you think that this slogan is being used, or this goal is being used a little bit too liberally by people that may not be serious about it? Or do you think the commitment to really achieving this is as ubiquitous as the use of the slogan is?
No, I think there are obviously some organizations and some companies and some governments that are more serious about it than others. But that's why we didn't just make an abstract commitment to net zero by 2050. We committed to a 22 megaton reduction and building the world's largest carbon capture network by 2030.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a very concrete interim target that we're holding ourselves accountable to, and we're obviously looking for support from federal and provincial government to reach that goal as well. But no, if you just say net zero by 2050, but you're not going to start until 2049, that's not a serious commitment. So
you were at COP27 in Egypt, and I know there is probably some skepticism about aspects of that from both sides. Certainly from some of the people kind of on the right side of the spectrum, I hear, why are all these people flying their private jets to Egypt to talk about something that maybe could be discussed on Zoom? and what's authentically happening there. And then on the other side, I think there was a lot of criticism from people on the left about the fact that industry representatives were there at all. And I know you did an interview on CBC on this, and some people suggesting that you were there to play a disruptive role, which clearly you were not. But what was it like being there, and what's kind of the mood, and what kind of reaction did you receive specifically at that conference?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I didn't fly a private jet there. I took a
You
30
didn't?
hour
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, no,
four
I
leg
know, I
journey.
didn't mean you, but yeah.
Maybe Bono and Bill Gates did, but I didn't. I'd never been to COP before, and it was really eye opening for me. I actually found it incredibly useful and productive because there were all kinds of people from countries around the world dealing with the same challenges in different industries, different geographies, different cultures, but they're all talking about like, how do we apply carbon capture to the cement industry in India? How do we do small modular reactors in Argentina, or what, and just to get that international experience, and the benefit of what policies are working, what policies aren't working, to have that dialogue with people dealing with the same challenges around the world was really, really useful. I think the other thing that is useful, we were not there trying to influence the negotiations. That was really the national delegations that were involved in that. And, we weren't kind of trying to suggest that the government of Canada should take this approach or that approach. But it was interesting to see what the debate was, because these international climate debates end up becoming domestic climate debates. So there is a debate about phasing out fossil fuels by 2050. There is a debate about going even faster on methane emission reductions. There's a lot of talk about what is a true net zero commitment. The former Environment Minister Catherine McKenna chaired a panel that came out with a very stringent definition of net zero, but the Glasgow Financial Alliance was talking about a more kind of moderate version of a net zero commitment. So these kinds of international debates end up becoming domestic political debates, and it's, I think, pretty important for us to be aware of where the debate is going.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess you said a couple things there. You talked about kind of observing the international debate, and then you also talked about, if I understood correctly, kind of the business to business collaboration. So, you're talking about how your work on carbon capture and storage can be applied in other geographic and political contexts. So, were there business representatives from around the world even where you could engage in that kind of business to business dialogue? Is that what
Yeah,
you were talking?
there
Okay.
were people from every sector, every country, and they were talking about the same kinds of challenges that we're dealing with in Canada. And Canada is actually a leader in carbon capture, and carbon capture was very much seen as a really important part of the solution at COP. And I think that's a fairly new development. I think a few years ago, people either weren't supportive of carbon capture. They thought it was better just to reduce emissions at source and not try to capture carbon, or they thought that the technology was too expensive and hadn't been proven. But Canada has actually been a leader in developing and proving carbon capture technology. So there was a lot of interest in the Canadian experience.
Fascinating. So in terms of the dynamic at the conference itself, you're observing the political debates, you've got the business to business side, but there is a whole kind of activist industry around these climate conferences as well, right? You have
Yeah.
the kind of Greta Thunbergs of the world. And so, I guess I'm curious, like, what are the proportions? Like, how many
Yeah.
of the people there are Mark Camerons and how many are Greta Thunbergs? And is there a dialogue that happens, or are you kind of in rooms that are totally separate from the rooms they're in and just ignoring each other?
Yeah, that was really fascinating because I didn't know what to expect. I think I probably expected that there would be much more of that climate activist presence, and it was certainly there. And I talked to Zipporah Berman when I was there, and I ran into people who were involved in different ENGOs, and there were protesters saying keep fossil fuels in the ground and all that kind of stuff. But as a proportion, I'd say there was a much higher proportion of people who were there to talk about practical solutions, whether they were business representatives or representatives of academic institutions or think tanks, and of course, obviously, most of the countries had
Yeah.
large delegations that were involved in the actual climate negotiations. So I would say, in my observation, and I know mine, it was a massive conference. I was not going to every event.
Yeah.
There were like 30,000 people there and all kinds of side events. But, I probably saw 50 or 60% in the business or industry association think tank world that were talking about solutions, and maybe 30% government delegates and 10% activist protesters.
Hmm. Yeah, that's fascinating because I think that's different from what a lot of people would expect the tenor of the conversation actually being. And tell us a bit about kind of the developing world, developed world divide. We've got developing countries that by some accounts are really bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change, and at the same time trying to develop their economies and maybe not having the same tools to do so within the parameters that are being impressed on the developed world when it comes to environmental standards. So, what was your sense of the conversations happening between those two sides?
Yeah, that was a really interesting part of the discussion, because one of the biggest issues in the actual negotiations was over what's called loss and damage, which is where the developing world is looking to the developed world to essentially pay for historic damage that's been caused by emissions in the industrial world. And I actually think that debate is to some extent counterproductive. I think everyone will acknowledge that the industrialized world has a responsibility to help the less developed world or the newly industrializing countries to develop in a clean, sustainable manner by sharing technology and perhaps by funding and financing. But this idea of reparations for damages, I think, just creates a polarization that I'm not sure is helpful. It's a bit like the debate about reparations for slavery in the United States. I'm not sure that actually it contributes to racial reconciliation. It really contributes to polarization. So I think there's a lot of support for taking new technologies in developed countries and trying to share them in less industrialized countries and to help finance them and so on. But when you start telling people that because they were born in the United States or Germany, that they have a responsibility to pay for something that their ancestors did burning coal 100 years ago, is not a helpful approach. So that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. And I guess you'd also wonder, I mean, it's always this debate around reparations for anything. It's like who pays it and who receives it, right? Like if this
Right.
proposal is for like a great government to government transfer, I'm not sure that the impacts will be will be really felt of receiving that money by those who need it most, right? So yeah, it does seem to me that that's separate, very much separate from the conversation around emissions reduction. So it's been really interesting talking to you about the climate change issue. I want to now, just in the kind of the final time we have, abstract back a little bit and dig more into some of the conversation we sort of started to have about shareholder and stakeholder capitalism. And I know you and I have sort of discussed this at other times previously. Just this very idea of a corporate alliance that is talking about sort of these long-term considerations. It goes against a lot of people's stereotypes, I guess, or maybe expectations. It also reflects a certain reality. I mean, you're talking about big international funds that are trying to put requirements around ESG on where they invest. This is a very different world from what we had a few years ago, or has this kind of always been the reality? What's your response, your thoughts on the sort of broader ESG movement as it's playing out in the climate dynamic here?
Yeah, I think there are definitely excesses of the ESG movement, and I've talked about some of those relative to European insurance companies, for instance, which are kind of at the cutting edge of this. But I don't really have a problem with the idea of ESG in principle, and I think the shareholder theory of value is perhaps a bit too narrow, and it's really an idea that's only existed since the 1970s. Historically, large companies were seen as having a broader sense of social responsibility, and I think that is reasonable and good. And as I say, companies should have an interest not only in their next quarterly report, but in the long-term sustainability of their companies and their industries. And we've always had social considerations, whether it's child labor laws or support for just charitable giving and things like that. That's always been part of corporate responsibility, and ESG is just adding an extra layer onto that. But I think as long as it doesn't become the one single objective, the shareholder theory of value sometimes puts the one single objective is maximizing return to shareholders. You talked about some people on the climate side saying the one single objective should be reducing emissions. And I just don't think there ever is one single objective. There are always many objectives, and you're trying to come up with the right balance between them.
Right. I think that's a good perspective, that sort of the good life entails a recognition of a multiplicity of goods and an appreciation for the fact that lots of different things matter. It's ideal that we not become narrowly activist for one specific kind of good at the expense of others, but we think about how these things trade off. And I guess one of the criticisms that I've heard of ESG in practice is that sometimes the E overwhelms the S and the G, so that you get positive ratings for companies that are involved in green energy, but that have very suspect practices around forced and child labor or products associated with that. So you're getting kind of the environmental consideration overwhelming the human consideration side of it. That's a good perspective. So and I mean, just to kind of summarize the debate for those that are maybe less familiar with it, the predominant vision of the obligations of corporations has been that they should realize value for their shareholders, and that's it. Whereas there are maybe older traditions and some new emerging traditions that emphasize that companies have certain forms of social obligation. This can be called stakeholder capitalism. Critics have called it sort of woke capitalism. We had a previous podcast episode on this debate with an author who's sort of more critical of woke capitalism. I think one of the biggest criticisms of companies that are understanding themselves as having social responsibility is that in the process they kind of arrogate for themselves power to determine what goods a community should be pursuing and not. So if a company or a large sort of market dominant fund says, this is how we're defining the good life, this is how we're defining what environmental social responsibility looks like, and we're going to invest in certain companies and not invest in certain companies based on that, then in the process they are taking for themselves political power that should more properly be in the hands of government, and that they are making determinations about the good life that actually belong to the wider community. What do you think about that criticism?
I think there are companies that have engaged in what I would agree is woke capitalism, and some of that I would probably share your criticism or the criticisms of this author. But I'm not sure. I do think companies have a right to be part of public dialogue. I mean, they're part of civil society, and I don't think we'd want to say that the state is the only institution that has the right to talk about what is the good life, right? If companies have an idea about what they think is good, they should be free to pursue that. They pursue that at the expense of producing profit for their shareholders. They won't be in business for very long. So it's kind of self-correcting. You can't just pursue the sort of social goals if you're not looking at your bottom line as well.
Right. Yeah. Like I don't think anybody would say that the people that are involved in the corporate sector shouldn't be part of public debates. I guess the problem comes where you have large market dominant funds, companies, whatever, and they say, well, we're going to blacklist certain industries or parts of certain industries because of a decision we've made. And that has the effect of forcing those companies to not be in business. Right. And like, is that, who should be making those decisions, right? Who should have enough power? So maybe the criticism isn't so much of companies caring about these issues, but it's of corporate power and the pernicious effects of it when it gets to a certain scale. But these are things that I think we should worry about a little bit.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I'd agree with that. I mean, I think when you have companies that are truly market dominant, whether they're large financial institutions or some of the large social media or internet giants that have disproportionate power, then they probably do have to be careful about trying to overly assert themselves politically. And I think governments do have some responsibility to keep that in check. But I'm not sure that a company putting out a sustainability report, crosses that line.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's lots of interesting tensions and balances here, and you can see sort of the potential harms of things going too far the other way. I wanna respect your time, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll give the last word back to you if there's anything that we've missed that you want to add about the work of Pathways, about climate policy, about corporate social responsibility, about COP. Anything else that you'd like to add in our final minutes here?
Sure. One thing that we didn't touch on that I kind of want to discuss is we're having a debate in this country right now and really around the world about what the best way is to help finance this energy transition. And we've really seen a game changer with the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. That we've seen the U.S. government put $369 billion on the table to decarbonize, whether it's CCUS or hydrogen or nuclear reactors or batteries, and this is a real game changer. And we've seen President Macron of France in Washington this week saying that the U.S. is putting too much into this, and can the U.S. please not spend so much money on climate? So which is quite a change from what Europe was saying a few years ago. But we have to deal with that in this country, because if we're going to do this large scale industrialization and achieve the kinds of climate targets that the federal government has put out, there is going to have to be more investment. And we're having to compete now with a US market where all of these areas are just taking off. So if we don't want all the battery technology and all the CCUS and all the hydrogen plants to be developed in the United States, then Canada is going to have to play this game to a certain extent, or we're going to be left out in the cold. So that is something that I think is an emerging issue for the next year, which we'll probably see more debate around in the federal budget. But that's something I just wanted to raise in the last few minutes here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Mark, thank you again for joining us. This has been a really substantial, rich conversation, and always good to hear your kind of nuanced thoughts and reflections on climate policy and on some of the other challenges facing us. Folks, we are out with new episodes of the Resuming Debate podcast every 2 weeks. We release them on Tuesdays. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Mark Cameron from Pathways Alliance. Please leave us a 5-star review, like, share, subscribe, and all that, and we'll be back with another episode of Resuming Debate in 14 days.